Why is Russia's geography so narrow? How the influence of geography has prevented Russia from becoming a global power. Navy Blue Nerd, reference source, Prisoners of Geography, Tim Marshall, Publishing House Nam, 2020. Russia, whose full name is the Russian Federation, is a country located in the north of the Eurasian continent, bordering the Pacific Ocean to the east, Arctic Ocean to the north, and other countries to the west. Eastern Europe, bordered to the south by China, Mongolia, and Central Asian countries. Russia is the largest country in the world, 17 million square kilometers of land spread across 11 time zones, equal to the surface area of the asteroid Pluto, and is the ninth most populous country in the world. World with 145 million people. Russia is huge in size. The width of Russia is up to 8,000 kilometers long, 3,200 kilometers wide, and spans 2 continents. Former U.S. vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin once said that, "You can see Russia when you stand on American soil," a statement that the media mockingly edited into, "I see Russia from my door." The truth is, from Little Diomede Island in Alaska, you can see the Russian-owned Big Diomede Island just 2 miles away. You can actually see Russia when you stand on American soil. Russia is large, but its geography is problematic. These geographical issues explain why such a world-class country is only ranked 11th in GDP, 61st in per capita income, and has a poverty rate much higher than other countries. Countries with the same latitude, Northern Europe and Canada, and explains many foreign policies of Russian kings and leaders throughout history. The best advice for you before continuing reading this article is to open a Google Maps tab next to the Spiderum tab, because if you want to know why Putin does what he does, look at the map. Warm water port. Russia is exposed to 2 oceans, but it seriously lacks direct access to an ocean that is not frozen for most of the year. This is Russia's biggest Achilles heel, preventing it from functioning as a global power. History has confirmed, strong navy plus developed sea trade equals strong nation. The most powerful empires were rarely landlocked, except Mongolia, but that was in the pre-maritime period. Always approach Constantinople and India, whoever dominates there will dominate the world. Constantly inciting war, not only in Turkey but also invading the Persian Gulf and going down to the Indian Ocean. According to Peter the Great's will left to the Russian crown princes. Russia is not without many large seaports, but these seaports all have one or more geographical limitations. Murmansk, St. Petersburg, and Vladivostok all freeze in winter. Kaliningrad is not frozen but is not connected to the rest of mainland Russia. Novorossiysk has a warm water port, but it is not a deep water port. Ships from St. Petersburg or Kaliningrad wanting to reach the Atlantic must pass through the Danish Straits, and Denmark is a NATO member. From Novorossiysk, if you want to get out of the Black Sea, you have to go through the Bosphorus Strait controlled by NATO member Turkey. Vladivostok's ability to access the Pacific Ocean is limited by the blockage of the Japanese archipelago, an important ally of the US. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan at the end of the 20th century also clearly demonstrated Moscow's dream of a warm-water military port. Top Communist Party members may not like the Tsarist monarchy, but they still take to heart the teachings of Peter the Great, seek access to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, Afghanistan has once again become the graveyard of empires, with both the British Empire and the Soviet Empire mired there, and most recently the US Empire. The Afghan War is likened to the Soviet Union's Vietnam War, and indirectly led to their collapse. And when talking about Vietnam, it is impossible not to mention that Cam Ranh Port was once the place where the Pacific Fleet of the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation anchored until 2002. The lack of a warm water port is also the reason why Putin has been uncompromising in the political brawl in Ukraine. In the south of Ukraine is the Crimea Peninsula, with a warm climate, millions of Russians living in the deep water port of Sevastopol. Sevastopol is an important location where Russian warships anchor. Crimea was conquered by the Russian Empire during the reign of Catherine the Great, and was returned to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, part of the Soviet Union, by Soviet General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev in 1954. A going away would probably make Queen Catherine and the thousands of Russian soldiers who sacrificed their lives to take over Crimea rise from their graves and strangle him. It's hard to blame Khrushchev. At that time everyone thought the Soviet Union would survive, and Crimea would always be under Moscow's control. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and the newly established Ukraine gradually leaned toward the west. Moscow immediately realized that this was a matter of life and death. If Ukraine joined NATO and Sevastopol became a NATO naval base, then Russia's power in the Black Sea was considered gone. Putin had no choice, he must annex Crimea. The referendum was condemned by the United Nations as illegal, but from 2014 until now, the entity that actually controls Crimea is still Russia. Russia's powerful Black Sea Fleet is stationed in Sevastopol, but like Novorossiysk, Russia's path to the sea is still blocked by Turkey. Annexing Crimea only strengthens Russia's position as a local bully in the Black Sea and does not help it become an oceanic naval power, but losing Crimea would likely be NATO's checkmate for Russia, and Russia cannot allow that. No one came to save Ukraine when it lost a piece of land the size of Belgium, except economic sanctions. Actually, that is enough to slow down the Russian economy, but will not make Moscow release Crimea. NATO leaders must have breathed a sigh of relief to each other. Thank God, if Ukraine had belonged to NATO, we would have had to act. If Russia attacks one NATO member, Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty will immediately be triggered. An attack on one member will be considered an attack on all, and all will be obliged to response. The US activated Article 5 after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, leading to NATO's intervention in the Middle East. Access to Russia's oceans would be easily blocked, which would devastate the Russian economy and limit the power of the Russian Navy. NATO understands that adding Crimea will not change the geographical pincer they have spread to lock down Russia. They could lose Crimea and avoid a costly war, but Russia could not. 2. Eastern European Delta. Another reason why Russia does not want Ukraine to lean toward the west is the vast strip of land known as the Eastern European Plain. Ruling over such a large territory, Russian leaders must have a very broad perspective, but from time immemorial they have always focused on the west. All of Russia is geographically bounded, except for the west, the part of Europe where 70% of Russia's population lives. Siberia is a great defense system. No army can advance from the east or south to attack Russia, unless they want to fight snow and taiga. The climate was harsh, the terrain difficult, thousands of miles of supply lines were needed, and the risk of counterattack was always present. The Caucasus Mountains prevented Central Asian powers from reaching Russia, and the only force that invaded Russia from the Arctic Ocean was the White Bears. But the West is a different story. In history, there have been many forces that wanted to destroy Russia from the West: the Poles, the Swedes, the French, the Turks, the Germans, twice, and today, NATO. In front of Russia is a vast space called the Eastern European Plain. This plain is shaped like a trapezoid with a small base in Poland, gradually expanding eastwards to a large base in the Ural Mountains. It is so flat that it looks like a road prepared for Western powers to easily march all the way to the gates of Moscow. Since the days of Ivan the Terrible, Russia's foreign policies have always revolved around how to defend Russia from the West, and the answer this first Tsar gave was, attack to defend. Defense. Constantly invading and expanding to create buffer zones to protect Russian territory, that is what Ivan the Terrible and his descendants forever tried to do. Whether you are a prince of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, a Tsar of the Russian Empire, a supreme leader of Soviet Russia or a president of the Russian Federation, you must always follow this teaching to defend your country in one way or another, either by invasion and assimilation, or by establishing puppet totalitarian governments in the name of spreading communism, or by tying up the economy in foreign affairs. Handover of those countries to Russia. Therefore, the Russia you know, whether it is a Tsarist Russia, a communist Russia or a crony capitalist Russia, is always an imperial Russia. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Moscow looked anxiously to the west while NATO moved closer and closer, admitting countries that had previously been Russia's buffer zones, and even post-Soviet countries. Right, especially the three Baltic coastal countries Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which do not have friendly relations with Russia. The Russia-NATO boundary, which once extended to the center of Germany under the Soviet Union, is now only a 2.5-hour drive from St. Petersburg. Russia is being held at NATO's throat. Moscow's buffer zone has now shrunk to 4 strategic locations where Russia needs to maintain its influence: Finland, Kaliningrad, Belarus, and Ukraine. These 4 points connect together to almost form a belt that hugs Russia's western border, and also isolates the 3 Baltic countries. NATO also wants to find a way to breach that buffer zone by attracting those countries to its side. That's the reason why in the political events of Belarus and Ukraine, you can see that they smell very clearly of the West, and you can also see that Moscow has been extremely determined to get involved. Belarus, the last authoritarian state in Europe, is still under the control of the pro-Russian government, whose representative is President Alexander Lukashenko. Lukashenko's rule makes Putin's government still look democratic. He has been president since 1994 and has not left his seat until now. Belarus's role in Russia's national security has been affirmed when Putin repeatedly voiced his support for his government, and promised to stand side by side with Lukashenko against the West. After the storm of political crisis and civil war swept Ukraine, the country was no longer in the loving arms of Moscow, But the West was also cautious with this country, because NATO understood that Ukraine joining the EU or NATO would have negative consequences. Could become the spark for a new war. Currently, fighting in eastern Ukraine is still sporadically breaking out, and the presence of Russian troops there has been confirmed. Moscow backs separatist states in eastern Ukraine in the hope of maintaining the presence of a buffer zone. Ukraine today is led by a pro-Western government, and NATO and Ukraine have held many military exercises together despite Russia's objections. The two sides are still playing tug-of-war in this country. Finland is currently neutral. As long as Finland, and beyond that Sweden, remain neutral countries, Moscow remains secure. The relationship between Finland and Russia can be simply understood as your relationship with your neighbor. In the past you had a big argument with him and beat him to a pulp, after which he stole a few things. Your potted plant and declares he has won, but at least he promises not to touch you again. Now you still don't like him, but every day when you go to work you see him on the street, so you and he still have to smile and wave to each other. About the Soviet-Finnish War, 1939 to 1940. Under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shared power in Eastern Europe, with Finland in Moscow's sphere of influence. The Soviet Union demanded a part of Finnish territory as a buffer zone for Leningrad, St. Petersburg. Finland did not agree. The Soviet Union sent bombers and ground troops into Finland. The Finns, with their guerrilla fighting style and taking advantage of the harsh winter climate, caused great damage to the Red Army. Finally, the two countries signed a treaty. Finland partially accepted the Soviet Union's initial demands. In return, the Soviet Union respected Finland's independence and promised to support Finland in the event of a Nazi attack. The Soviet Union basically achieved its goal, but this was also a great spiritual victory for the Finnish people. 3. So why has not Russia been swallowed? There are two reasons why Putin's Russia is still navigating well against geographical obstacles: oil and natural gas. Russia is a powerhouse in energy, especially fossil fuels, the world's largest gas reserves, the world's largest gas export, and the 8th largest oil reserves. That's not even considering the huge reserves that may lie beneath the ice shelves of the Arctic and the frigid tundras of Siberia. And who are their biggest customers? It is the EU. The closer you are to Moscow, the more dependent you are on Russia for energy. Finland and the Baltic countries are almost completely dependent on Russia for gas. Eastern European countries are about 60 to 80% dependent, and especially host country Germany imports more than half of its annual gas from Russia. There is a sword pointing straight at the heart of the EU that Russia holds at the hilt. That sword is in the shape of gas pipelines, pipelines where the Russians have full authority to increase or decrease the flow. Without Russian gas, the above countries will have a serious energy shortage after 10 days. This also makes Germany seem less enthusiastic in its condemnation of Russia than countries less energy dependent on Russia such as the UK. Countries that have better relations with Russia pay less for energy, for example Finland. Of course, Europe seeks to diversify its gas supply, such as investing in building seaports for liquefied gas imported from the US or the Middle East. However, dependence on oil and gas from Russia is still very large, and will be difficult to change this century. An economy that depends too much on oil like Russia is not a strong and stable economy, but the Kremlin can still maintain oil and natural gas as two types of soft power to manipulate Europe. This also explains why Russia is relatively reserved in conferences on combating climate change. As long as oil and gas are still the axis of rotation of the world, Russia's power will still exist, even more so when the Earth as the ice warms and the ice melts. They will have access to the vast oil and gas reserves that lie beneath the Arctic Ocean and Siberia. Russia is one of the few countries benefiting from climate change. 4. Summary. The Russia you know, even as a country Tsarist Russia, a communist Russia or a crony capitalist Russia, is always a Russian empire. The Russia you know, whether it is a Tsarist Russia, a communist Russia or a crony capitalist Russia, is always an imperial Russia. Can Vladimir Putin or any of his successors carry out that mission successfully? Or perhaps, God has set a fate for his Russia that cannot become a great power? Of course, geographical factors are not everything that makes a strong country, but history proves that it is a decisive factor in the development and decline of each country. From the Grand Duchy of Moscow, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union and now the Russian Federal Republic, Russian kings and leaders have always faced the same problems. Even as Russia's ideology changes, from monarchy to communism or crony capitalism, the problems of Russia's geography remain. The Eastern European plain is flat, and the ports are either closed ice, or lying in an awkward position. Chess is the #1 favorite mental sport in Russia. And the geographical chess game that God presented to Russia, which has been played since the time of Ivan the Terrible, is still in the beginning.